Hi, good afternoon, or good morning, or indeed good evening, and welcome to this webinar on methane money and metrics, how big ag is shaping South America's livestock climate policies by changing markets. I'll be your moderator for the next 75 minutes. It's going to be an intense one. My name is Mike Walker. Just before we get started, I introduce you to our stellar expert panel. Just want to give you a sense of what we hope and expect you will leave with in 75 minutes time. And that is a clear understanding of what global warming potential STAR is, what it does, what it doesn't do, and why its misuse is problematic for climate goals. That's first. Secondly, we'd like to give you an overview of the science on methane and its impact on global heating, and why reducing it from animal agriculture is important. Then also, we'd like to give you an understanding of which actors are pushing for methane measurements to change and understand how no additional warming approaches could negatively impact the Paris Agreement. And finally, we'd like to introduce you to some recent papers and research by Maximiliano Manzoni and Professor Hannah Daly, which highlight these issues. You'll see throughout the course of the webinar on several of the slide deck pages, you'll see a QR code that will bring you to an online Google Doc with a list and links to all of the papers and background information, but also to a short profile of each of our 5 panelists. And just now to introduce you to that panel. So firstly, we're going to have, I should say as well, actually, just give you a choreography. So the panel is Nicholas Carter. He is Director of Environmental Science at the Game Changers Institute. He will then be followed by Maximiliano Manzoni, who is a Uruguayan investigative journalist and whose investigative piece was the motivation for this webinar. He will then be followed by Nusa Urbancic, who is CEO of Changing Markets. Then Professor Hannah Daly, Professor of Sustainable Energy at University College Cork, and who recently published a paper on this in the Irish context. And then Shefali Sharma, Senior Global Agriculture Campaigner with Greenpeace. But just maybe before I introduce or invite them to get started, just to give you a brief sort of overview. So, as you perhaps are all aware, methane has a significant impact on climate in the short term. It is also, though, 80 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. Global warming potentials, GWP, are used to compare the global heating impact of different greenhouse gases. While GWP 100 and GWP 20 have been widely used, GWP star is a relatively new way to look at shorter-lived gases like methane. While the metric of GWP star is not problematic per se, it can be being misused by high polluters can use GWP star to present even minor reductions in methane as negative emissions or even cooling. Using a 20-year baseline, some proponents have even pushed for no additional warming approaches, which serves to effectively grandfather historic emissions. If that is a lot, it'll, as I say, be explained. Specifically, actors in several heavy livestock countries, including Uruguay, Paraguay, Ireland, and New Zealand, have been pushing. We have some concern that the trends towards misuse of this GWP star, and that's what we're going to hear about for the next 70-odd minutes. The webinar itself, we're going to do it in 3 stages. The first one will be a bit of context setting by the panel. Then we're going to have a bit of a panel discussion, and then that will be followed by a Q&A. So if you have any questions in the course of the presentations, please put them in the Q&A function, which Alma and Lily will be keeping an eye on. Similarly, feel free to use the chat. Just maybe, go light on that because it can be a bit of a distraction to the actual presentation. And we'll be keeping an eye on the chat too in case any issues come up, which we want to bring to the panel itself. Okay, so with that, I would like to invite Nick to give us a bit of a backgrounder on methane and GWP star.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, and great to see you all. So I first want to set the stage and acknowledge that we're not doing well in addressing methane. If we just go to the next slide, methane is 262% above pre-industrial levels, and it continues to rise. And you can see two different timescales there. Now, why does this matter? I think it's important to set some context to this. Current climate commitments put us at about 2.7 degrees warming by the end of the century. And that degree of warming might not mean much to everyone, but this means very likely less food access and yields, increased extreme weather, increased trade and war disputes, and just a less livable society for people and animals. So the stakes are high and we need to see quick action. Now, importantly, warming over the next decade will come almost equally from methane as it does from carbon dioxide. Now, methane is far stronger than carbon dioxide, but only lasts a decade or so, but it's still adding and accumulating stock to some extent. And carbon dioxide lasts centuries and accumulates, but it's not quite as potent. So cutting methane, within the decade is really, it's our emergency brake to avoid runaway feedbacks, feedbacks, things like permafrost that could also release even more methane. So today we're discussing, proposed new ways to measure methane relative to carbon dioxide. And as Mike mentioned, there's different ways to do this, and it's usually formed into a carbon dioxide equivalent. Think of like an exchange rate type of thing. And metrics like GWP 100 is what many of the global climate agreements are based off, the Paris Agreement, for example. But GWP 20 has also been proposed in some ways, and there's about a dozen other ones too. Now, to me, I think we want a metric that can see trends of change over time, as well as assign a burden of change and accountability to the biggest emitters. And next slide, please. Now, importantly, food is the biggest share of human-caused methane at about 40%. Most of this is coming from animal agriculture, about 80% or more. And this is from belches, from ruminants like cattle, but also mass amounts of manure from the many confined animals. Now, massive increases in livestock numbers, as shown here, have led to a 332% increase in methane emissions from farmed animals from about 1890 to 2014. And as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, showed in their recent report, AR6WG3, increasing the 4 billion farmed animals globally is directly linked with increasing CH4 or methane emissions. The next slide, please. There is an increasing myth put out even before something like GWP star, and it's largely pushed by industry centers like the UC Davis Clear Center. It's a story of cycling emissions, right? Cycling emissions with livestock. And really, this is a ploy to pretend that methane from so-called natural sources affect the atmosphere differently from fossil fuel sources from deep underground. Now, we know this is false from satellite imaging, infrared cameras, air samples, long-term monitoring centers, etc. The atmosphere doesn't care where the methane emissions came from. And the IPCC also makes this clear. It shows that biogenic and fossil methane have roughly the same effects. There's about a 1% difference in them. And that tiny difference only comes from that grass uptake before the cows belch it out. So there is no cycle of methane. There is a ton of increase in livestock numbers, which is increasing methane. Now, another point proponents of changing how methane is measured is that they want to accept like our current levels of methane as a baseline. Now, this is not acceptable, but that's what is proposed in these kind of change over time metrics like GWP star. And just for a little context, before I wrap up on GWP star, it was first introduced at COP24 in 2018, And it attempts to reflect how methane behaves differently than CO2. It measures this kind of rate of change versus each pulse of emission. Now, this quickly attracted support beyond its creators and almost exclusively from those affiliated with beef and dairy industries and countries where agriculture comprised the highest share of emissions. And the originators of the metric have been busy pitching this as well to livestock organizations and reps who've been trying to use it to argue that stable or slightly reduced methane means they're climate neutral or so-called add no additional warming, which we'll get into more. But this masks the fact that the emissions still hold global temperatures higher. And even GWP star creators in recent peer-reviewed publications will say, and I quote, GWP star is mainly useful as a metric for measuring a permanent global change in methane emissions, not per country, not per company. And essentially, this is the only way it's being proposed to be used by the advocates of GWP star is per country or per industry. And that's not at all of use. And importantly, GWP star is being used by these high emitters. And they may now be improving efficiency to some extent. This is mostly through intensive factory farming, which of course has some trade-offs, but they still emit substantial amount of methane. And that's what this graph is showing. Like we're setting a baseline right there, either 10 or 20 years behind. There's about a 20-year look back period from time to time, but this ignores the impacts to date from some of these highest emitters. So, and I think an important ethical component to this is that this disproportionately impacts the under-resourced global south or global majority who may have a very small but increasing herd to meet basic food security. So I think the bottom line is the way in which we choose to measure environmental impacts can hide history, and it can easily be used to greenwash. So to meet global climate goals, we need metrics that track both impacts fairly and ones that also hold these kind of biggest polluters accountable to basic accountability of climate science.
Excellent. Thanks, Nick. That was thorough. Cool. Now I'd invite Max to give us a overview both of his investigative work with a sort of a specific lens on what's happening in South America.
Thank you, Mike. Next slide, please. I want to always also thank Changing Markets for the organization of this webinar and also acknowledge that my work was supported and is supported by the Bertha Challenge. So I want to talk you about this true crime story that we've been following in the last 2 years in Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil, and it's how the livestock industry pushed this metric, global warming potential. Next. So what we found is in the last 2 years, and specifically working very thoroughly in the last 6 months, is that we found exclusive documents, photos, and videos that show how, since 2022, Frank Mitnoetner, who is a researcher at the Clear Center and the UC Davis in California, traveled to Paraguay, Uruguay, Argentina, and Brazil with the goal of pushing for a new way to measure methane that Nicholas explained so well, which is the main greenhouse gas related to these countries and to livestock farming, which is methane, right? This new metric, which is the global warming potential star is pushed by Frank Noetner at the Clear Center, and the Clear Center is funded by at least $3 million from iFeeder, which is an organization linked to JBS, Cargill, and Tyson Food, among other corporations from the act, with the goal to rethink methane. Next. So just briefly to get some of the receipts, you can see in the middle, this is the memorandum of understanding between iFeeder and the Clear Center back some years back. And the left side, you can see some of the members that get funding from iFeeder. iFeeder is sort of this educational organization for the American Food Industries Association and also Cargill and some more. And to the right, you can see some of the documents that Clear Center actually produced and showed to iFeeder. These documents were first reported by Unearth. So thank you, the colleague, for the work as well. And the specific goal was to rethink methane and change the way that we will discuss it in climate policies. Next. So what is in South America, how this is affecting the region? In Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, Bitnoetner's presence was supported by the livestock trade unions who hold incredible power in these countries. And they are related to the so-called Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, which is a global organization where Bitnoetner is an advisor and includes a feeder contributor, like I said before, Cargill, JBS, Tyson Foods, among others, business representatives from the world's largest meat producers, and multinationals such as ADM, McDonald's, and Burger King. In Brazil, Emmet was also invited by JBS to talk with Big Ag representatives about global warming potential star. Next. So sort also the receipts, you can see to the left the meeting he held in Paraguay in 2022. I was actually there in Asunción when he talked not only to livestock trade unions, but also representatives of the Climate Change Commission. And this is important for something I will tell you a little bit later. In the center, this is actually a meeting in the Executive Tower in Montevideo, Uruguay. The Executive Tower is sort of the White House in Uruguay. And there, Mittner is with the now former Minister of Environment, and the now former Minister of Agriculture of the past administration. And to the right, you can see Mittner in this forum of Methane on Pecuaria, which is methane on agriculture, which was organized by JBS also in 2022. In the top, you can see a sort of timeline of events between 2021 and 2024, all the troubles of Mittner in the 4 countries. Next. So how is Mittner influential into the climate policies in these countries? In Uruguay, we actually got access to contracts and documents, and also travel findings, and also payments of public money from the Lacalle Pou government to Mittner to advise the government on climate policies and the specific adoption of global warming potential star, all ahead of COP27 and in Egypt back in 2022. And following his visit in Paraguay, the livestock unions who were present and had a seat on the Climate Change Commission in Paraguay successfully pushed for the inclusion of this metric in the official climate policy. Paraguay officially put in their national communication to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change that they were talking about and investigating about putting this metric in the official climate policy. And in Brazil, he met in these JBS events with representatives from Embrapa, some of you may know, is a private public entity on agriculture policy who advised the Ministry of Environment and the Ministry of Agriculture of the Brazilian government, even now. And Embrapa had an ongoing campaign for the adoption of this metric this year in social media, all ahead of COP30. Also in Brazil, Miles Allen, which is one of the creators of this metric from the University of Oxford, was last year also pushing for the adoption of this metric this year of COP30 in Belém. Next. Some of the receipts about what I was talking about. To the left, you can see some of the documents we actually found out. This is a confidential report that sent to the Lacalle Pou government, when you can explicitly say that he wanted the Uruguayan government to adopt this metric. In Paraguay, this is our internal documents from the Climate Change Commissions, where representatives that were in the talk from Mittner. One of them is a former professor of Mittner, a guy called Albert Glatzle, and they actually put the metric into the official climate policy of the country. And in Brazil, you can see some of the receipts of the ongoing social media campaign from Embrapa for the adoption of this metric ahead of COP30 this year in Brazil, in Belém. Next. So how this is problematic to South America, not only to South America, but the discussion on climate change and climate policy. The adoption of global warming potential star in these 4 countries will allow the livestock farming in the 4 countries to reduce their emission and or increase their methane emissions while claiming to be in line with their government's climate commitment. For example, the newest NDC from Brazil that was published last year, and even claiming carbon credits. This is something very important because last year at COP29, the Article 6, the new carbon markets regulated by the Paris Agreement, was put in charge, and most of these countries want money from that as climate finance. This obviously puts in danger the goals of the Paris Agreement, as Nicolas explained so well. Next. And even if Paraguay and Uruguay are the smaller countries and the ones that don't get a lot of attention on these kind of issues, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Brazil negotiate together agriculture issues at COP30, where JBS is openly already challenging how we measure big ag's impact on climate. This is an excerpt from a 2 weeks ago piece on Bloomberg, where JBS is openly talking about putting in the spotlight and next COP the discussion about how we measure the climate impact from livestock industry. Next. So to finish it up, this is the whole map of relationships we're working on in the last 2 years. When we see this guy, Frank Midnoetner, which is the director of the Clear Center, how he got money from iFeeder, which related to the Meat Institute and the American Food Industry Associations, how he's the advisor to the Global Sustainable Beef and also the International Beef Alliance, which is a group on also livestock trade unions from Uruguay, Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, but also Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and the US. Next. And how he is related to all these travels and how he influences specifically climate policy in the 4 countries. Something that is very important and is something that if for European organizations is this figure called Ars Glatzle that I talked before, which is not only the representative, the Paraguayan representative of the livestock trade unions on the climate change policy in the country, but also is a known negationist and is related to Clinton, which is a Dutch-based European negationist group, who was actually the group that tried to put this metric in the latest IPCC report. So something for our European friends to get hold into this year and next year is the how key this organization is also for these efforts. Next. And you can read more about this in the whole investigative pieces that we call the Special Methane Wars. It's published by Climate Tracker Latin America and Consenso, which is a newsletter on climate justice and disinformation from Paraguay. And this project is supported by the Berta Foundation. And I will look up for your question later. Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you, Max. That's a really good summary of what is a powerful report that you've done. And as said before, it's linked in that document that you've seen in the QR code. Okay, Max, you gave us a sort of a spotlight on principally South America. I'd like to invite Hannah now to give us, I guess, a bit of an overview of how use of GWP Star has potential global impacts on food inequality, but then also, I guess, going from that macro down to a micro of the Irish example and how GWP Star is playing out there. Hannah.
Thanks, Mike, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining and thanks for having me here. So I'm the only presenter without slides, so hopefully I can keep your attention for a while. I have no graphs. So I'm here to talk a bit about the Irish context in terms of how GWP Star and different metrics and targets are being used to change proposals for changing how agricultural methane is being counted in national targets. I know we'll talk about New Zealand later on, and the context is quite similar. So I'll talk a bit first about the Irish context, and then a paper that I was recently involved in that was published, which has a link. So Ireland's emissions profile is very unusual for a high-income country. Around 40% of our greenhouse gases are from agriculture, mainly methane from cattle, reflecting our export-intensive livestock system. You've probably had Irish beef or butter Ireland is generally a high emitter, one of the highest per capita emitters in Europe. It also has a powerful agri-lobby and a long history of policy protection for livestock farming, so it's generally part of the political process and enterprise strategy. At the same time, in 2021, we established a new climate act, which required very ambitious legally binding carbon budgets, which were aligned with the Paris Agreement, as well as other factors, and mandates climate neutrality, by no later than 2050. But the law explicitly doesn't define what climate neutrality means. It was widely understood as being net zero. That's zero GWP 100, where any emissions are balanced by removals. That's the standard metric. But there has been a very strong push to change how methane is accounted for in this target, and there might be justification for changing how methane is indeed accounted for. But the new program for government explicitly commits to advocating for change in how methane is accounted for, both nationally and internationally at the EU and global level. And they signal an intent to create a more favorable framework for livestock effectively. So where we're at the moment is our second carbon budget cycle, where the legally binding carbon budgets for the 2030s is being established. And our climate change Advisory Council is an independent body with statutory role under the Climate Act to recommend carbon budgets. And for the first time, they have proposed a framework which sets down explicitly what this climate neutrality means. And they've interpreted this to mean temperature neutrality or no additional warming, not net zero. And now a paper that I mentioned was published a few weeks ago. The link is in the chat and the notes for this. And that was led by colleagues at the University of Galway, Colm Duffy and David Stiles. The paper actually doesn't even barely mentions GWP star, but the issues in terms of GWP star and temperature neutrality are very closely aligned. And I'm going to talk a bit about that. I've already spoken about what GWP star is. It's a new way of reporting the change in heating from the flow of methane emissions rather than the absolute heating from methane emissions. So under that framing, if methane emissions are stable or decline slightly, their additional warming appears to stop. So if you've got just a steady stream of methane emissions, you can say that that's temperature neutral. It's temperature stable, or there's no additional warming from that steady stream of methane emissions because it's short-lived gas. So the methane you're emitting now, in theory, balances the methane that was emitted 12 years ago. But what it doesn't represent is that there can still be a very high absolute cumulative warming from the ongoing emissions. So basically, if GWP star is 0, and if that's your target, GWP star equals 0, not GWP 100, then a country or a sector can consider itself temperature neutral or climate neutral. And in our paper, we questioned whether this is in alignment with the Paris Agreement, because our carbon budgets are required to be in alignment with the Paris Agreement. And I'll talk a bit about why this is problematic, why temperature neutrality fails various tests of the Paris Agreement for high methane emitting countries or sectors. First of all, the Paris Agreement has several core requirements. First of all, a commitment to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and pursuing 1.5 degrees. Secondly, countries are required to pursue their highest possible ambition, reflecting their capacities and responsibilities. As part of that, there's a commitment to peak and decline emissions as quickly as possible, basically to return from to limit warming as quickly as possible, and also to return from any overshoot of those temperature goals. And there's also questions of common but differentiated responsibilities. Basically, rich countries with greater historical emissions and greater capacity need to do more than poorer countries. And temperature neutrality, in other words, adopting GWP star equals 0 as your target, fails on most of these counts. First of all, it locks in ongoing warming from your high stream of methane emissions. So methane might be short-lived, but ongoing emissions still sustain very large contributions to global warming. If you're just considering the rate of change, then you're ignoring the absolute warming from that stream of emissions. Like Ireland's per capita agricultural methane is already among the highest in the world, and under temperature neutrality, Ireland could be still warming the planet at this steady rate from this ongoing activity, ongoing emissions, while claiming neutrality. And that's, of course, inconsistent with Paris, which requires not just halting the increases in warming, but actually reducing warming to return to 1.5 degrees after overshoot. So as we already heard, cutting methane emissions quickly is crucial to meet these climate goals, because anthropogenic methane emissions have caused around 0.5 degree of warming already. It's anyone can see how unfair that is. Temperature neutrality, it grandfathers in current high emitters from countries like Ireland, New Zealand, or sectors with high methane emissions, while poorer countries or with low baseline emissions would face tighter limits. And that undermines the principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibility. It rewards high historical polluters with ongoing methane rights. And, Paris, effectively, as I already said, countries with greater historical emissions and wealth under the Paris Agreement should do more, not less. But temperature neutrality actually does the opposite. It locks in the privileges of high emitters, and instead of highest possible ambition, it delivers a minimum ambition framed to suit countries with large livestock sectors. So, like a simple analogy is like a factory which might have been historically putting in 100 barrels of pollution into a river every week. It might go from 100 to 90, barrels a week, and they might claim that they're cleaning the river. Whereas another factory, which had no had no pollution, and wanted to increase to, let's say, 5, they would be heavily punished. They would say that you're heavily polluting the river, instead of saying, well, this factory is at 90 and this factory is at 5. So that's the essence of grandfathering. And I want in my last couple of minutes as well to talk about not just, I suppose, counting stable methane as temperature neutral under GWP star or temperature neutrality. It's already been mentioned, but declining methane emissions can be counted as cooling, which is equivalent to carbon dioxide removal. And that's very problematic because it's sort of like a cooling offset rather than counting the warming from ongoing methane emissions. Methane reductions don't actually reverse the warming already caused; they only slow down further increases. And why it's unfair is that it gives a double reward for high historical emitters. First, they get to lock in high methane baselines, like that factory going from 100 to 90. They say that we have the right to 90 still. But second, any modest reductions let them offset their ongoing CO2. So they might say that, okay, the 10 that I've reduced, that gives me a license to pollute more. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to the discussion, but to just to close, was Ireland, like all other countries, with legal obligations and moral obligations under the Paris Agreement to deliver on climate action that's compatible with 1.5 degrees as much as possible. And using GWP star is a way to, I suppose, unfairly grandfather high methane emitting rights, which will lead to inadequate action under the Paris Agreement, and the incorrect signals. It really redefines the goalpost, which is very problematic. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Hannah. That was both a comprehensive, but also quite a sort of a scary overview of how GWP star can be sort of cynically manipulated and presented. And I think, as you suggested, it will be good to come back when we have a bit of a discussion to understand almost like how Ireland as a country, what risk that poses. Ireland is an actor, and I think many of us know that next year Ireland will have the presidency of the EU, which puts it in an even stronger or more influential position. But before then, Nusa, can you give us a sense of, I mean, if Hannah's described to us, I guess a country scale concern or conversation, who's driving that? And I think you can give us a little bit of an insight into that.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, and great presentation so far. So, why are we talking about methane so much also? It's because at COP in Glasgow, now almost 4 years ago, we had a global methane pledge that actually now over 150 governments have signed up to, and that pledge is actually obliging them to cut methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And that is actually at the lower level of what the science says is needed. And that also means that the largest source of methane, which is the livestock sector, has to do something, has to rapidly cut their emissions. And what we have seen is that now there's this massive push for GWP star, which is targeting policymakers, and it's causing confusion because you have some scientists that, seem very credible saying one thing, and you have other scientists saying something different. So in the best case, this might lead to delays in methane mitigation from livestock. But in the worst case, we might get GWP star adopted at some levels. And that means that potentially the action on methane, not just in livestock, but even more widely, could be derailed. And I want to show a couple of graphs, if you can just bring them up, where we try to also estimate what this would mean for companies. So here this you can find in the report Seeing Stars that we published in November 2023. And you can see we try to calculate what would 30% methane reductions by 2030 mean for one meat and one dairy company. And one thing to add here, very often these companies or their industry associations claim that GWP star would mean more accurate reporting of methane emissions, but most of these companies do not report their methane emissions at all. They even don't report their overall greenhouse gas emissions. So we had to estimate that. We used those estimates from our previous report with Emissions Impossible Methane Edition that we did with Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. And we took their 2020, 2021 emissions as a baseline, and we looked what would happen if they cut their methane emissions by 30% by 2030. So you can see Tyson at the top, and you can see top left their total emissions using GWP star. And at the bottom, you see their total emissions with GWP 100. So 30% reduction would mean that with GWP 100, Tyson would still have to report emissions equivalent to annual emissions of Peru. But with GWP star, they would be able to claim massive reductions, like 83 million tons. And they would be able to claim climate neutrality just with 12% reductions by 2030. We see similar situation with Fonterra. Fonterra is the biggest New Zealand dairy producer, and their emissions are kind of equivalent. They would be equivalent to Sri Lanka even with 30% cut. But with GWP star, they would be able to claim 19 million tons of negative emissions, right? So it's not just reductions. We're talking actually about negative emissions. And you get this, you see top, we have non-methane, so that's carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And on the left, you see methane with GWP star or, with GWP 100. And Fonterra also, they would be able to claim neutrality with 16% reductions by 2030. So this is kind of how big this changing this metric would be. And I think the sector is aware that they have a little bit of a problem because that makes it look really, really unrealistic. So they have been having some discussions around that. But it seems that the push is really for the big livestock producing countries, not just Ireland and New Zealand, but others as well, to actually adopt this metric. And we see this happening. I think what we probably see is just the top of the GWP star iceberg. We've seen also agronomists in Slovenia are pushing for this as a better metric. We see, we see in the US, the National Cattlemen Beef Association pushing this, also providing funding for Frank Mitloehner to kind of make the case for this. And we see also other scientists. So the two that invented this metric, Miles Allen and Michelle Kane, they already started this push with New Zealand in 2019. And just let's go to the next slide. So this is the one where we try to calculate what the GWP adoption would mean for New Zealand. So we actually went for Miles Allen. He had this op-ed where he was saying that 19% reduction by 2050 would mean that New Zealand would be climate neutral. And you can see above GWP star and below GWP, below is GWP star, above is GWP 100. And you can see that in 2031, New Zealand can start claiming negative cooling from methane reductions. And 19% is really not a lot. It's not in line with the Paris Agreement. But you can then see what this means for other sectors. So other sectors can start doing much less on emissions reductions because they're getting this, how Michelle Kane called it nicely, courtesy of New Zealand farmers, right? They're getting these small reductions, and on the back of that, they don't need to do anything anymore. And I think that brings me nicely to New Zealand, and we can hand over to Shefali to talk a little bit about what's happening there.
Cool. Thanks, Nusa. Yeah, definitely concerning like contamination of other sectors as another potential. Yes, so Shefali, New Zealand, how's this playing out there?
Thanks everyone for having me on the webinar. You actually have breaking news because this story is actually developing in New Zealand this week. As some of you may know, New Zealand has a coalition government, the first time ever with three parties in its history, and one of the libertarian parties from the coalition has just declared that they want New Zealand to pull out of the Paris Agreement because it's not good for the farmers. It's unfair. It's too ambitious, and net zero is too unrealistic. And it would hurt New Zealand farmers, to which their coalition partner, the Prime Minister from the Conservative Party, has responded that pulling out of Paris would not be good for New Zealand farmers for obvious reasons, because New Zealand depends heavily on exports to many countries who are in the Paris Agreement and who and also to buyers like Nestle and others who are saying that they respect Paris and they want to make and have commitments to reduce their emissions. So, but they will be announcing, he said, very, very shortly. So this could be at the end of this week or early next week, what they're going to do with their methane target. So some of you may know, with the Labour government, New Zealand became the first country to actually set a methane-specific agriculture methane reduction target of cutting 10% by 2030 from 2017 levels. This government came in and rapidly started to overturn many regulations, freshwater rules that had been created because New Zealand's livestock industry has led to massive water pollution in freshwater, groundwater. And so there were a lot of rules in place. They've all been steadily been hacked away at in the past year. But on top of that, they established a methane review panel to actually see what they could. In fact, they had put this in their coalition agreement that they're interested in no additional warming principle and the use of GWP star to do so. So and the beat for the methane review panel was to figure out what the no additional warming target would look like, which would significantly be obviously weaker than and actually, ironically, within 24 hours of them publishing that, the independent New Zealand Climate Commission had also published their own assessment, which is a scientific body, and they had actually urged New Zealand to be more ambitious on their methane. So for the, New Zealand, like Ireland, 49% of its emissions come from agriculture, 43% is methane, 43% is CO2, then you've got nitrous oxide and other gases. So methane is a huge issue. I was just looking, Hannah, as you were talking about per capita, and New Zealand's per capita methane is even more than Ireland's, right? It's 5 billion people in that country. So New Zealand plays a really outsized role when it comes to dairy exports. It's one of the largest, if not the largest, exporter of low value dairy products, milk powder, butter, and the big powerhouse behind that, as Nusha said, is Fonterra, which claims to be a cooperative, but essentially functions like a multinational corporation. So what we're seeing playing out now is basically we've had major lobby groups like Federated Farmers, Dairy New Zealand, um, and others, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, that have been asking the government, even, right on day one before it came into power, they had a huge list of things that they wanted repealed. And certainly that played out. Greenpeace New Zealand, Aotearoa, actually did a Freedom of Information request and uncovered all the documents that these lobby groups had given. And in many instances, each of those policy measures had been taken by the conservative government. And it's not a coincidence that the president of the Federated Farmers then became the associate agriculture minister for New Zealand on the first day of the government. So, Nusha's talking about vested interests, and we see some real vested interests in basically stopping or rolling back important environmental, even for the farmers in New Zealand, right? Like if we want the industry to be sustainable, then we need functioning groundwater, we need functioning rivers, and the intensity with which it's being produced. And similarly, climate change has huge impacts on New Zealand as well as elsewhere, and therefore and as they recognize, they have serious issues around exports, and they're an Annex 1 country. In June, 26 scientists wrote to the New Zealand Prime Minister saying just that please listen to science. You're an Annex 1 country. You have a responsibility to be ambitious. Please do not water down your methane targets. And so I think we await with bated breath in the next few days what the government's going to do. But we feel like the fact that one of the coalition partners has come out and said, pull out of Paris, if they weaken the methane agreement, it's going to look like, oh, well, we're in Paris, but, it's okay. It's not that bad, right? It's better than not pulling out. So it could also be a kind of a smoke and mirror exercise, but regardless, yeah, hopefully they will listen and keep the methane target as it is or make it more ambitious, but we'll see. Thanks.
Thanks, Shefali, and for that sort of breaking update. And as you say, it's that again is quite a sort of a sinister move by one of the coalition members, particularly as you say, if it actually just then creates a sort of a compromise, which in itself is alarming. But those are the sort of dynamic days in which we're living. So having sort of, I hope, established for all of you a sort of a context for the issue, for GWP star. I would say, I think Alma has done it, but certainly invite you, if you have any questions you'd like to put to the panel, to put them into the Q&A. But now I'd just like to give actually the panel itself an opportunity to sort of respond to each other. And maybe I'll kick it off by one question just to Nusa. We've heard a little bit about the big ag actors that have an interest in manipulating GWP star. We've heard about how that's getting traction, most recently in New Zealand. But what about the NGOs? What about civil society? How are they responding and seeking to mitigate what I think we're talking about is a significant risk here?
Yeah, great question. I think we all see there is a significant risk to that metric, and also we see the incredible power of the farm lobby and how great they have been in the past 5 years to delay, distract, and derail climate action in the sector. And we basically have co-signed a statement that was signed by over 70 NGOs that basically, is calling against the adoption of GWP star, and this has been sent to a few governments as well. And of course, we try to be very influential and powerful, but it seems that, the way the farm lobby works, they have their own, channels, they have their own scientists, they have their own newspapers. They're communicating often directly to farmers, and the message is very attractive. This is not about methane, is not a problem. It's all part of the cycle. You can be part of the solution. You can be part of, you're basically being unfairly targeted, right? Well, what you are doing is actually part of the solution. And there's like direct calls by the scientists. Like I've seen that in your article also, Max, that Miles Allen is asking people, farmers and these companies, to actually lobby the governments to adopt this. And again, GWP star at the global level, not a problem. At a country level and company level, it is a huge problem. And this is how the lobby wants it to be used.
Thanks, Nusa. And maybe on that, just before maybe going to the Q&A, is there any sort of questions between the panel? No? Okay, cool. Well, then in that case, I would like, just looking at the Q&A, and one question which has come in, apologies if I mispronounce this, from Gilherm, about do you think the main challenge for global South countries lies in the economic profile and concentration of power among those who dominate agribusiness, as in the case of Brazil, or in their capacity to exercise agency in shaping and implementing laws and public policies? Maybe I'd invite Max, if you have a response or an answer to that. And thank you, Guilherme, for the question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's both, but I need to highlight this in countries like Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay. And then I will talk about the four because they are very close economic blocs, or Mercosur is kind of like the European Union in that sense. And in the agricultural policies, they are always on the same page. But you need to also understand that we have like some kind of agricultural exceptionalism in these countries. So that also helps. For example, in my Uruguayan passport, I have a cow in the front of my Uruguayan passport, also in my Paraguayan passport. But to get to the need of that question, you need also to understand that these multinationals, big corporation, holds an incredible political power inside Congress and all kinds of regulatory entities in the four countries. So either if it's a left government or social democratic government, or a more extreme right government, it's the same people who are like engineering the agricultural policies in these four countries in the last 20, 30 years. So in the case of Brazil, it's very important to say this. Like even with the Ministry of Environment being in even open war with the big ag side of the government, the Lula government in particular have a very tenuous peace with them, and also the soybeans and the livestock industry had an incredible power to shape media narratives around this. Obviously, this metric is one of those examples, but I like also to point it out, the whole discussion about regenerative grazing and regenerative agriculture that we are seeing ahead of COP30. This COP happening in Brazil, in Belém in particular this year, have the possibility of being very challenging for journalists and organizations to actually cover critically in these countries the issue of agriculture and the metric itself. So to respond, even if we have like better regulations, better balance of power, the disparity of political influence and economic side is very challenging in these four countries.
If I could just jump in here too, I think important to this topic is many independent scientists kind of speaking out and critically evaluating GWP star and its use in the real world. And the recent effort I really liked was found at biogenicmethane.org, and a dozen or so independent scientists signed this, which was an open letter to President Luxon, or Prime Minister Luxon, as I understand it. And Hannah, you were one that signed on it. And I saw a recent stat in a paper from Zhang et al. In 2022, and it showed that methane emissions related to the dairy industry have increased fourfold over the past 130 years, right? And New Zealand being such a huge dairy country, I mean, what is this kind of like? I'm curious to learn a bit more, and maybe you could share about like this no additional warming, and what this will do to all these like historic impacts in a country like New Zealand. Like, does it kind of like forget about that?
I'm sorry, Nick, was
Yeah.
that to me?
Yeah, Hannah. Yeah.
Sorry, I missed my name.
Yeah, could you speak about that letter? I'm curious about that letter. So there's, dozens
Yeah.
of scientists that collaborated together on it.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, the letter can be found at biogenicmethane.org, I think, and the link is in the notes for the webinar as well. This with a lot of high profile climate scientists, much higher profile than me, senior IPCC authors and so on, wrote a letter to Prime Minister Luxon of New Zealand uh, in response to the independent assessment recommending the adoption of GWP star temperature neutrality as the basis for New Zealand's long-term ambition, which I already spoke about, which is being considered to be adopted in Ireland as well. It gained, as far as I'm aware, quite a bit of media traction in New Zealand, and it raised the same issues, very simple, in very simple language that I spoke about, effectively that temperature neutrality is inadequate for high methane emitting countries and sectors. It might be adequate for low methane emitting countries, because effectively that is GWP star is zero, is equivalent to GWP 100. But for high methane emitting countries and sectors, temperature neutrality is not adequate under the Paris Agreement, and it's also unfair because it requires, like, these high income, high emitting countries get to do more in future. So I'd recommend, if the audience is sort of not clear yet on how, like, what precisely is the problem with GWP star, I think it's very nicely articulated.
Thanks, Hannah, and Nick, and even Max. I'm gonna go check my Irish passport after this because I find it hard to believe that there's not a cow in there somewhere. But Hannah, if I may, I'm not going to ask you to check your passport while we're here, but just maybe a related question in the chat is GWP 100 isn't a very accurate metric for looking at methane. So what can be used instead to make sure incentives for reducing this gas are clearly marked? Which I think also talks to the little bit about the clarification around GWP star as a metric.
Yeah. I like, that's a great question, and it like underlies a lot of confusion about different metrics. It's not that GWP 100 is not accurate. It does what it says on the tin. It measures the cumulative warming of a gas in the 100 years after it's emitted. You could pick GWP 1000, the 1,000 years of warming, or 20, and the number would change. So in a way that is accurate, it correctly quantifies the warming, but effectively the choice of metric is a political one, and it's one of pragmatism as well, because it is different countries can choose different metrics to set their targets, but they have to specify how do both the targets and the metrics that they're using to get there add up to be adequate under the commitments in the Paris Agreement. So a country could choose GWP 20 or GWP 500, but if that does not add up to, I suppose, an approach that is fair and adequate to limit global warming, then there's a problem. So I think, and this, I'm looking at some of the other questions as well. GWP star is attractive to scientists, especially the sort of coming from a physics background or maybe a climate science background or engineering background, because it replicates, effectively acts as a simple climate model, because it replicates the actual warming profile from gases more accurately. But so there's a sort of a feeling that there's an appeal that is a better physical sciences approach, but there's huge normative assumptions, value-laden assumptions underpinning the choice of that metric that have not really been addressed by a lot of the scientists who maybe find it appealing from a physical, climate impacts approach. So the question is, what can we use instead to make sure incentives for reducing this gas are already clearly marked? I mean, under GWP 100, there's a very clear incentive for reducing methane if the target is zero, because you have to get to net zero of all greenhouse gases. There's and I think that question is still being played out in the literature, if I'm honest.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay. Yeah, it's a work in progress, and I think to Noosa's earlier point, it's a work in progress, but it's also a bit of an iceberg with some very inherent risks below the surface. Shefali, did you want to come in here with both a question and sort of potentially rhetorical answer?
Regarding
I think it was regarding maybe one of the comments that Hannah had made.
Yeah, so one question for you, Hannah, is I had asked the climate negotiator in Bonn at the intersessional how the Irish government was dealing with this with their new program, this interest in accounting for methane differently, both in Ireland and at the EU level. And his response was that Ireland has an ambitious climate target, including a reduction of agriculture by 25%, and that they will continue to report GWP 100 because that's what is done at the IPCC. Someone had a question, I think, in the chat that said, what are international bodies doing about it? And the last, my colleague, we had a meeting with the IPCC, and they actually said, well, we're going to continue to use GWP 100. There isn't any foreseeable change there, and what countries do with their targets is up to them, right? So it's a similar thing that we've been saying on this webinar. But can you maybe elaborate a little bit, because it turns out he's the same person who was kind of advocating for GWP star internally, and it seems like
Yep. There's a very strong push, not just from the agri lobby, but from within government, from within our Department of Agriculture and research bodies within Ireland for this new approach. First of all, it's correct that we have a national target to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by 2030, agriculture emissions by 25% by 2030 relative to 2018. However, projections under current policies show agriculture emissions are set to rise. The premise of our agriculture emissions reductions is more the adoption of efficiency measures. There's still projected strong growth in dairy output and a moderation in beef production. So, and at the same time, the argument to adopt GWP star would allow that 25% reduction in agriculture emissions to count as cooling, or the methane reductions to count as cooling, so that in the long term, the agriculture sector could be positively emit CO2 and nitrous oxide, which are long-lived gases, while maybe reducing methane by 5% a decade or 10% a decade, while still maintaining very high methane emissions. So while there is a target to reduce methane emissions, first of all, that's not backed up by policy, and second of all, just reformulating how that is counted allows much less transformative change in our agriculture sector. And that's something we haven't really spoken about. What is actually needed to cut methane emissions more dramatically? It is really to reduce livestock, ruminant livestock output, and that requires this. It's not as I suppose terminally threatening to the livestock industry as it would be for the fossil fuel industry, because we know we need to basically get rid of all fossil fuels to reach net zero. For livestock, to reduce methane emissions by 100% would require getting rid of all cows, but by 50%, which might be a more fair approach, would require a moderation in livestock products. So there's that dynamic too.
Thanks. Mike, maybe I can ask the question and answer. I don't know if somebody can queue up the 2 slides that I missed in my excitement to talk about New Zealand, but Greenpeace published a report last year where we calculated the emissions of the methane emissions of the oil majors and the livestock majors. And also, there's some questions about this cooling effect. And Hannah, you rightly said that what reducing methane drastically would do is actually slow down warming, because we've accelerated absolute emissions so much that, it's about slowing it down. How close can we get to limiting it to 1.5? How close can we be to well below 2.0, as you said? And what we did is that we actually used a model created by Casey, who did this for EDF and also a peer-reviewed journal, modeled FAO's projections of meat and dairy in middle and high-income countries. I mean, what would meat and dairy consumption and production look like by 2050? And conversely, if the Eat Lancet diet, if we produced in line with what the Eat Lancet diet is in terms of production and consumption, just in high and middle income countries, you see that's the cooling effect. It would be 37% less. So what we found is that just the livestock sector alone would add another 0.32 C to warming by 2050 if we are in business as usual. And if we make a U-turn, I think somebody asked this question about, changing diets may be too slow and that maybe we need to then think of technological solutions. Well, I have news, right? I mean, and this leads me to the other slide quickly. Oh, yeah, there you go. I think it's not just about consumption, right? It's about what is motivating these companies to profit. Nusha showed this. What we find is that these guys are huge emitters and they have no intentions of stopping unless governments change how we value companies, until we figure out how we value financial stability, climate risk in rating companies, until we actually say, hey, guys, you have to cut emissions. Governments have to cut emissions. We need mandated obligations to hold these companies accountable, as well as governments to reduce their agriculture emissions, particularly Annex 1 and industrialized countries who have the means to do so. So I just wanted to flag that. Thanks.
Thanks, Shefali. And as we sort of get towards a close, maybe Max, I have a question for you. What we've clearly learned, I think, over the last 60, 70 minutes is that this is a complex issue, a difficult one at times to both explain and even understand. But in your experience working in South America, but also as an investigative journalist, do you have any thoughts or experiences even of how you explain and how you talk about GWP star with non-experts, particularly farmers or those with an agricultural interest?
Yes, something I learned, I discuss about a lot with the team. We work on the more like impact communication sides of this investigation. It was focusing less on the technical side, of focusing more on the impact this have in the everyday lives, even of smallholder farmers. What we talk about the grandfathering of historical emissions, how this is unequal for small farmers, how this even go against the interests of the same livestock trade unions who push for this metric for either ideological reasons or cultural reasons, or sort of alignment against anti-globalism on the whole, on the Paris Agreement they have, right, between the Dutch farmers and the South American farmers. There's a lot of parallelism there. And focusing more on this inequality and also focusing a lot on how in our region in South America, we are already suffering a lot for climate extreme events. I always say that in Paraguay, it's very hard to be a climate negationist because it's so hot in here. We have like a lot of drought in Paraguay, Uruguay, and Argentina. We have a lot of water problems that we usually didn't have 20 years ago. We have this big flood in Rio Grande do Sul last year in the southern part of Brazil, where there's a lot of agricultural lands. We have the suffering of a lot of prices going up on foods that usually are cheaper in this part of the world. So being closed in this kind of issues and closing the gap of knowledge, which was one of the main objectives of this research as well, is like closing the gap of knowledge even with the farmers themselves, and also separating what is the big ag companies that give a hold of power with government discussions from everyday farmers, because sometimes they get the stream of information from owned media by these big oil companies, but that doesn't mean that we can have a sort of bridge to get an understanding of what are their fears and what are their anxieties around climate policies. I think we need to have a lot more of be curious and not just judgmental, like what Whitman said, about where their anxieties are coming from. And that doesn't mean to like have a free pass that everything they say and everything they support is right, but be more close to what we can talk about. But very specifically, less on the technical side, very easily explaining how this affects inequality in climate policies, how this is at the end of the day, this is a new chapter on the long story of big corporations, big ag, and some governments on delaying tactics and disinformation to get away free of their color on climate policy and responsibilities. And that's something that I try to ingrain a lot. And obviously, not only with farmers, but we talk about non-expert people in the cities when just explain how this affects their everyday lives with climate extreme events and food prices, it is more easily understood how this could affect them and why they need to get more knowledge and more understanding of the issue.
Thanks, Max. That was a really good response, and I particularly like the idea of the need to be curious and almost that perspective of we talk a little bit deep listening. Okay, we're getting really close to the end, and I have a feeling in terms of the panel, Nick and Shefali, you've just got some closing comments you'd like to make in our remaining less than 2 minutes. So maybe Nick, if you want to go first, and then Shefali.
Yeah, I just want to very briefly broaden this perspective to land. So let's say the GWP star is adopted more widely, and some of these big meat and dairy companies do these small little techno tweaks to perhaps reduce slightly. This does nothing to solve the issue of land. I mean, livestock uses about 37% of all ice-free land. And if you look at land use metrics too, there's a lot of manipulation with land use metrics too. Like direct land use change has a similar like 20-year look back period as GWP star has. And with direct land use change, that doesn't factor in like hundreds of years of deforestation or opportunities to rewild and sequester carbon, which would be like a carbon opportunity cost of land. And I think that is changing in those metrics. But I think it's really important that, these different ways we measure environmental impacts can really skew historical impacts. And, with land, with beef, 60% of all the world's agricultural land is used for beef cattle. And this doesn't officially give us calories or protein. It's only about 2% of global calories or about 5% of global protein. So even if we were able to have GWP star and some of these small tech tweaks to make it better, beef would still be by far the most land intensive greenhouse gas emitting food that we eat. So I think like we need to look at solutions and what are things that can free up land. Well, we know that kind of broad just shifts to plant-based diets or ways in which we can promote it we would free over 3 billion hectares of land. We're talking like the size of Africa. So these are solutions that have like wide application for carbon drawdown, for biodiversity, or whatever you want to do with land. And it could even include land back programs and things like that. So I think GWP Star is one little piece, but if we look at these broader environmental metrics, there's lots of little things that, although technical, they can make a big difference in terms of where we go in the future.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Shefali, we're right up against it.
Just quickly, there are prime ministers, however, who are speaking out, like Barbados on behalf of climate vulnerable countries that are actually asking for mandatory binding cuts to methane. And I think there's, if anything, this webinar, even though I know these issues, alarms me that these governments are moving so fast, but many governments don't even know this is happening, and many policymakers don't know. So it's great to have this great participation, and I hope people will go out there and make this a public issue that needs to be brought out. So thanks, Changing Markets, for organizing this.
Thank you, Shefali, and that's very relevant closing words. So that's it. We're just a tiny bit over. Apologies for that. I very much hope in the last 75 minutes we have achieved the objectives we set out to do, and you have no problem repeating GWP Star ad infinitum. So just to say thank you to very much to the panel, to Shefali, to Nick, Max, Hannah, and Nusa. And for the Changing Markets team that were working in the background, to Caitlin, Lily, and Alma, who were managing the slides and the chat and the Q&A. Thank you very much, and very much enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.